Amid the fiercest blizzard in Stonevale's history, a lone Mustang stood, bleeding, painting the snow red. From the shadows, a pack of starving wolves emerged, and no one believed he had a chance. But when death was breathing down his neck, with every fragile heartbeat, he made a choice. Not to run, not to fight, but to stand still. And in that stillness, something shattered. Something ancient. Something no one had dared to believe could be broken. This is a story that will leave you trembling, crying, and believing that the strongest force in this world is not claws, not bullets, but trust, ignited in the heart of despair. Join Gallop of Glory on a journey that will never leave you the same. No sound warned of it. No whisper of wind. No omen in the sky. The blizzard came down on Stonevale like a hammer from the gods, obliterating every trace of life. In less than 30 minutes, the clear blue sky disappeared, as if a sacred promise had been broken. Black clouds boiled from the north. They tore over the mountaintops like beasts clawing at the heavens. And the light faded into nothing. The air thickened, until you could hear the snowflakes colliding, breaking apart like glass. Shards of frozen knives falling from the sky. The wind howled. But it wasn't the wind of nature. It was a wail. The mourning cry of a dying world. The pressure of the air. It pressed against the land, like an invisible hand, squeezing the very breath out of those who remained. And the trees, they bent low under its weight, their old trunks cracking, as if they too were crying out in agony. And there, at the heart of the fury, Sorrel stood, not as a warrior, not as an unbroken spirit, but as a ghost stripped of soul and faith alike. His mane, once a brilliant blaze beneath the sun, was now whipped into bloody, tangled lashes by the merciless wind. Each blast of freezing air tore across his battered body, leaving burning welts like flayed skin. He was soaked in blood and snow, until you could no longer tell where the wounds ended and the ice began. He lifted his gaze toward the horizon, where once his herd had thundered together across the plains, where once brothers and sisters had run under the stars. Now there was nothing but faint traces already swallowed by fresh snow. No one waited for him. No one looked back. They had left him to be torn apart by the storm. Another gust slammed into him. Sorrel collapsed into the snow, forelegs buckling, shoulders shuddering violently. The pain wasn't just in the gaping wound along his side. It radiated through his entire being. An invisible, choking anguish that no remedy could heal. It was the pain of betrayal. Not by man, but by his own kind. By nature itself. The very force Sorrel had spent his life believing was just and eternal. He snorted harshly, trying to suck air into his burning lungs. But each breath crystallized into white mist the moment it left his mouth. Each breath was a battle for survival. Each heartbeat a grim reminder he wasn't dead yet. But he was close. Around him, the snow fell thicker and heavier. There was no longer sky or earth. Only an endless, smothering white. Sorrel swept his dim, bloodshot eyes across the landscape. Nothing but white. Suffocating. Infinite. He tried to rise. His muscles spasmed violently. Pain shooting from the torn flesh up into his spine like a live wire. But he forced himself up. Against the blizzard. Against the dying. Against everything. Just for one more step. just to push back the tightening noose of death a little longer. And then, through the keening wind, a new sound wormed its way into his ears. A howl. Distant, but unmistakable. Clear as a death knell. Sorrel froze. His ears pricked sharply. His body turned rigid. The cold that crept through him now wasn't from the snow. It was the cold of recognition. The predators were coming. Another gust struck Sorrel like a lash of frozen steel. He stumbled, legs buckling under the invisible weight. Each breath now felt like a dagger drilling deep into his lungs. Each blink seared his eyes as if his very eyelids had turned to brittle ice. Yet the agony that tore through his flesh was nothing compared to the convulsions racking his heart. Another howl echoed through the storm. This time, closer. Much closer. Sorrel lifted a hoof. Or tried to. It was more like dragging a body too broken to move through the suffocating snow. His legs felt like carved stone. Every nerve screamed with searing pain that reached the marrow of his bones. And the gash along his left flank. Now with every shaky step, a fresh ribbon of bright crimson spilled onto the snow. Behind him, the blood formed a thick, heavy trail. A vivid, raw banner waving to the predators lurking just beyond sight. He knew. He could hear them. Soft footsteps, lighter than breath. Breaths misting the air, silent as a drifting fog. Yet ancient instincts, carved deep into the soul of every wild creature, whispered an irrefutable truth. Death was closing in. Ahead, the snow began to thin. Through the dense curtain of mist, Sorrel glimpsed sparse trees. A thinning line that might, just might, mean the forest's edge. Perhaps a final chance. He staggered toward it, every step a war waged against his own traitorous body. Every tendon, every bone shrieked at him to stop, to surrender, to let it end. He remembered. When he was just a colt. How he had raced across the vast fields of Stonevale. Swift as the untamed wind. No rope around his neck, no fear in his chest. He had once lifted his head high under a sky ablaze with stars, believing the world belonged to those strong enough to seize it. Now he limped like a beggar across a frozen ocean, his life ticking away with every rasping breath he could still steal from the storm. Don't stop. Don't stop. He screamed the words inside his mind, even as his body faltered. His thin legs quivered. His muscles spasmed in violent protest. His vision swirled. White. Red. Black. But he dragged himself forward, bloodied and broken, toward that faint smear of light at the forest's edge. Behind him, the wolves' howls rang louder, each one a death toll hammering the air, driving him onward step by torturous step. They didn't need to rush. They knew. The wounded never escape. The bleeding never run far. The first shadow detached itself from the mist. A gray-furred wolf, soaked from the storm, its golden eyes burning into Sorrel as if savoring the feast to come. Behind it, 3 more. Then 5. Then 7. A silent circle closed around Sorrel. The wind shifted, carrying the reek of wet fur, the metallic tang of blood, the raw stench of hunger. Sorrel staggered. He whipped his head around, exhaling a thick cloud of steaming breath. The lead wolf bared its fangs. Its wet, snarling mouth gleamed under the muted light, sharp as polished daggers. But it didn't lunge. They were savoring the fear, drawing it out, tasting it before tearing into flesh. Sorrel stomped his hoof into the snow, producing a dull, hollow sound. A gesture of defiance? Or just the last reflex of a body refusing to die quietly? He let out a broken, hoarse scream. A whinny so feeble, so pitiful, it shamed even himself. The wound along his flank tore wider. Another gush of crimson fountained onto the snow. The wolves growled louder, stepping closer, narrowing the noose around him, one deliberate pace at a time. Sorrel backed away, step by halting step, until his haunches hit a tree buried deep in snow. No more room to run. The freezing wind stabbed through his torn flesh like shards of ice. Sorrel's vision blurred. The world became a smear of gray and white and crimson. He could barely distinguish shapes. The outlines of trees, the movement of wolves, the horizon itself twisting and folding in on him. Through the swirling mist of pain and snow, Sorrel thought he saw a figure, far away, flickering in and out of view, dark as shadow against the blinding white. He blinked furiously. The wolves howled, long, guttural wails that painted the night with death. Sorrel strained his neck, holding his breath. Hope? A hallucination? Or the final mercy of a dying mind? One more step. Just one more. He gritted his teeth, summoning every last shred of will, and hurled himself toward the narrow break in the trees. Behind him, the wolves screeched, paws ripping through the snow, closing in like arrows shot from the jaws of hell. With every agonized step, Sorrel carried not just his battered body, but the last fragile ember of belief that there was still a reason to survive. The wind slapped Sorrel's face like a sharp, wet blade. The wolves tightened their circle, not lunging, not attacking, but squeezing him slowly, deliberately, savoring every heartbeat of terror. Sorrel ran. It could no longer be called running. It was a desperate, dragging crawl through the storm. Each time his hooves struck the ground, the snow cracked under the impact. With every faltering step, blood spurted from his side in dark, viscous jets. With every breath, a fresh shockwave of pain ripped through his collapsing body. The world spun in a haze of white, red, black. The wolves slithered through the mist like specters, never losing pace. Sorrel gasped for breath. The cold air tore his throat raw. Each inhale a fresh assault on lungs already seizing from cold and exhaustion. His heart pounded erratically. No rhythm. Only the chaotic hammering of terror and failing life. And then, his hoof caught on a hidden mound of snow. He tumbled forward. His heavy body crashed onto the ground with a thud so final it seemed the earth itself shuddered. A spike of pain split up his spine. So bright, so sharp, it exploded behind his eyes like a burst of fire. Sorrel cried out, a desperate, broken sound, more sob than scream. He writhed, struggling to rise. But his legs twitched helplessly, spasming like snapped branches. All he could do was lie there, bleeding, helpless, exposed to the fangs drawing nearer. The wolves halted. They formed a tight half-circle around him. No hurry. No hesitation. They knew. The broken thing lying in the snow was already theirs. Their low, growling chorus rumbled through the blizzard, a grim symphony echoing across the night. The lead wolf crept closer. Its golden eyes gleamed with ruthless hunger. Sorrel stared back. In that frozen moment, death became real. Not an abstract terror. Not a whispered fear. A living thing. Teeth. Claws. Hot breath steaming against his face. Sorrel flinched instinctively, his whole body trembling, not from cold, but from the raw, primal will to survive. No. Not like this. A whisper inside his mind. Faint. Defiant. Not here. Not now. Not in blood and ice and despair. Mustering the final dregs of his strength, Sorrel jerked his head up, forcing himself upright a fraction. Pain tore through him like a jagged blade. More blood spurted from his side, spraying the ground in vivid, brutal arcs. But he didn't care. He stood, legs quivering, head lowered, ears pinned back, breathing hard through flared nostrils. He planted his hooves into the snow in a stance of broken defiance. The wolves hesitated. They sensed something. Not power, not strength, but a will that refused to break. The lead wolf crouched lower, preparing to leap. Sorrel pawed the snow, white vapor streaming from his nostrils. Even in death, he would face it as a warrior, not as rotting meat. And then, a gunshot shattered the night. The crack rang across the blizzard, slicing through storm and silence alike. Smoke curled into the freezing air. Sorrel whipped his head toward the sound, heart seizing in shock. Through the raging maelstrom, a figure emerged. A woman, riding a white horse. Her black cloak whipped violently around her, snapping like banners in the storm. She leveled a rifle at the wolves, her face carved from stone. Her eyes held no fear, no hesitation. Only a command as absolute as life itself. Survive. The wolves faltered. The lead wolf growled, tail lashing. But its eyes flickered uncertainly. The rifle's voice had pierced the predatory hunger. One step back. Another. The wolves began to retreat, tails low. Maris nudged her mount forward. Not fast. Not recklessly. But with steady, unshakable resolve. Her mere presence pushing the predators back. Her rifle remained aimed, finger tight on the trigger. No yelling. No pleading. Only the fierce, burning defiance of someone who refused to let death win. Sorrel watched her, with everything that was left of his shattered heart. In that frozen wasteland, amid the shrieking winds and closing fangs, amid his own blood steaming on the ice, he saw something he had not believed in for a long, long time. Courage. Hope. A reason to keep breathing. The wolves slunk away into the swirling storm, leaving only Maris, her white horse, and Sorrel, trembling, but still standing. She said nothing. Lowering her rifle, she tightened her reins, guiding her horse toward him with cautious grace. Sorrel shook. Every instinct screamed at him to bolt. But his body was too broken to move. And something deeper, something beyond fear, held him rooted in place. Maris stopped 3 paces away. Her gaze softened, and in a voice rough but steady, she spoke, the words slicing cleanly through the storm. Easy now, little warrior. I've come to take you home. The storm hissed between them. Sorrel staggered back a step, nostrils flaring, his breath a wild plume of vapor. Blood dripped steadily from his side, staining the snow beneath his hooves in dark, spreading blooms. Across from him, Maris dismounted in one fluid motion. She let the rifle fall. The weapon hit the ground with a dull, final thud, vanishing almost immediately under the snow. Then, slowly, deliberately, she knelt down. Not as a predator, not as a conqueror, but as something far more dangerous. A soul refusing to give up. She spread her hands wide. No defenses. No demands. Only a naked, silent offering. Sorrel hissed through his teeth. He lowered his head, ears flat against his skull, and let out a guttural, broken roar. The last ember of a spirit battered to the edge of extinction. He pawed the ground once, twice. Snow sprang up in defiant bursts. Maris met his burning, half-crazed gaze without blinking. Her voice, low, hoarse from cold and raw from truth, pierced the maelstrom. Either we die here, or we live together. The words hung in the frozen air like a thread between two shattered worlds. A tense beat. Sorrel shuddered. He could have charged. Could have longed, ended it. Instead, he collapsed onto his knees. Not in surrender, but in a brutal, reluctant admission. He could not do it alone anymore. Maris exhaled slowly, frost billowing from her lips. Without a word, she stepped forward, inch by inch, until her bare hand touched the side of Sorrel's blood-caked neck. The contact was electric. The great stallion flinched, but did not pull away. A silent pact was made that no storm, no death, no betrayal could break. They were bound. By survival. By desperation. And by something far older than either could name. They moved. Stumbling. Bleeding. Breathing in shallow, freezing gasps. Maris led, hand clenched in Sorrel's tangled mane, whispering encouragement that was almost drowned by the screaming wind. Sorrel followed, half-dragged, half-driven by something beyond reason. The storm hammered down, erasing all tracks behind them within seconds. But they were not alone. Shadows skulked along the edges of vision. Dark figures slipping through the mist, silent as wraiths. The wolves had not given up. They circled, patient, waiting for one stumble, one fall, one final collapse. Sorrel faltered. His knees buckled, sending him crashing into a drift. Maris nearly went down with him. Only sheer stubbornness kept her upright. She clutched his mane tighter, bracing herself, pulling with every ounce of strength. Not yet, she rasped into the roaring wind. Not here. Not like this. Several times Sorrel jerked his head, fighting the invisible chains tethering him to her. Instinct screamed at him to run. To bolt into the night, into death, into oblivion. Each time, Maris held firm. Each time, she whispered into his ear, not pleading, but commanding. Stay with me. Trust me. Slowly, painfully, Sorrel learned to stagger forward again. And yet, there were moments when Maris herself nearly collapsed. Her boots sank deep into hidden crevices. Her knees buckled from exhaustion. Her vision swam with black spots that threatened to swallow her whole. At one point, she slipped. Fell to her hands and knees. The cold biting instantly into her exposed palms. Sorrel stopped. Watched. Waited. And in that fragile heartbeat, Maris realized it wasn't just her saving him anymore. As she stumbled to her feet, Maris's mind slipped sideways, dragged into memories she had buried deep. Years ago. A different storm. A different fight. She had found another creature, broken and bleeding. A tiny foal, not much bigger than a lamb, collapsed near a frozen creek. And she had chosen to save it. Instead of circling back to find her son, who had fallen behind during the search. When she returned, it was too late. The snow had swallowed him whole. A life, her child's life, snuffed out like a candle because she had gambled and lost. Since that night, Maris had sworn. Never again. Never again would she abandon a soul in need. Never again would she leave someone to the merciless cold. Even if it meant losing herself this time. The wind tore at her coat, tried to rip away her will. But she pressed on, hand clinging to Sorrel like an anchor. Dragging him, dragging herself, through the storm. One broken, stubborn step at a time. Because this time, she would not fail. The snow thinned. Ahead, through the tattered remnants of the blizzard, Maris caught sight of it. A crooked chimney, thin smoke trailing into the dying light. The cabin. Sanctuary. Only a few hundred yards away. But the wolves knew it too. As if sensing the nearing salvation, they surged forward. Growls rumbled through the mist, deep and guttural. A monstrous drumbeat behind her and Sorrel. Sorrel staggered. Maris tightened her grip. Just a little more, she whispered hoarsely. Come on, come on. But her voice was swallowed by a fresh chorus of howls. Predators poured from the trees like living shadows. A dozen shapes. Maybe more. Snarling. Snapping. Fangs glinting under the broken sky. Maris knew they couldn't outrun them. Not like this. Not wounded. Not exhausted. This would be their final stand. She pivoted sharply, positioning herself between Sorrel and the advancing wolves. Rifle raised again, her last bullet chambered. One chance. One shot. Her heart hammered painfully in her ribs. No time to think. Only to act. The lead wolf, a hulking brute with a torn ear, lunged forward. Maris squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle split the air. The bullet punched into the snow at the wolf's feet. A warning. Not a kill. The wolves hesitated. For a moment. Sorrel whinnied weakly behind her, legs trembling, about to collapse again. She turned her head slightly, speaking through gritted teeth. Stand with me, Sorrel. Or we both die here. Something flickered in Sorrel's bloodied eyes. Recognition. Trust. Or maybe just a stubborn, indomitable refusal to let this be the end. With a shuddering breath, he stepped forward. Shoulder to shoulder with her. A battered warrior and a broken woman. Side by side against the night. The wolves circled. Snarls tore at the silence. Snow sprang under their restless paws. The wind carried the scent of blood. Of fear. Of the ancient, brutal song of death. Maris felt it then. The shift. Not just in the wolves, but in Sorrel. He lowered his head, stamped a hoof into the earth, and let out a deep, ragged scream of defiance. A noise that wasn't just pain. It was challenge. It was life refusing to be snuffed out. The wolves faltered. Predators, yes. But not fools. The bond between woman and horse radiated something primal now. Not weakness, but a new force they hadn't expected. Unity. Defiance. Fire. One by one, the wolves began to back away. Eyes gleaming. Tails low. Snarls dying into wary silence. The pack melted into the mist, swallowed by the storm they had once commanded. Maris let the rifle fall again. She turned, leaned against Sorrel's trembling body. And together, they stumbled the last few yards toward the cabin. Behind them, the blizzard faded into an eerie, watchful stillness. Ahead, the promise of warmth, of healing, of one more sunrise. Inside the cabin, Maris dropped to her knees. Sorrel collapsed beside her, sides heaving, body caked with ice and blood. The door slammed shut behind them. The storm was locked out, but its scars would remain. Maris pressed her forehead to Sorrel's, closed her eyes, and breathed. For the first time since the storm began, she allowed herself to believe they had survived. Tears she hadn't known she could still shed slid silently down her cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the bitter cold. Sorrel's breath, ragged but steady, washed over her like the warmest balm. They were broken. They were battered. But they were alive. And they had found something neither had dared hope for. A second chance. Inside the battered cabin, the world outside felt like a distant, broken nightmare. The fire crackled low in the stone hearth, its wavering light throwing long, restless shadows across the timber walls. Sorrel lay crumpled on a bed of old blankets and straw, his sides heaving, his blood-smeared coat rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Each gust of wind that slipped through the cracks made his muscles twitch, made his ears flick nervously, as if expecting the jaws of the storm to rip the walls apart and drag him back into hell. Caleb worked with quiet urgency. Hands scarred from years of labor moved over Sorrel's broken body, cleansing wounds with herbal poultices, wrapping torn flesh with strips of linen made from an old shirt. He spoke little, only the occasional grunt or a murmured prayer to gods he wasn't even sure he believed in anymore. It wasn't words Sorrel needed. It was the steadiness of a touch that didn't demand, didn't dominate, only offered. And it was Maris, sitting silently nearby, hands clenched into trembling fists, watching every wince, every shudder of the horse she had staked her soul on saving. Night after night, the three of them waged war against death with nothing but firelight and stubbornness. And gradually, the blood slowed. The fever broke. The wound along Sorrel's side began to close, leaving ugly, puckered scars across his ribs. Physically, he was surviving. But inside, something far worse festered. Sorrel would stand in the stall at night, his head drooping low, his ears flattened back, staring at nothing. The crackle of the fire would make him flinch violently, as if it were the snarl of wolves reborn. When Caleb moved too suddenly, Sorrel recoiled so hard he crashed into the stall walls, hooves scrambling against the wooden floor. The body was healing. The spirit was not. Every beat of his heart seemed like a countdown, a slow, inevitable collapse waiting to happen. And then, under the cold gaze of a full moon, the collapse came. It began with a sound, a distant howl, rising through the still night air, piercing the silence like a blade. Sorrel's head snapped up. His eyes, wild, glassy, searched the dark corners of the cabin. Another howl answered. Closer. Hungrier. And the terror broke him. With a guttural cry, Sorrel reared up, his hooves crashing against the wooden stall in a frenzy. The blankets tangled underfoot. The weak bindings Caleb had used to limit his movement snapped like threads. Blood sprayed as his freshly scabbed wound tore wide open again. Sorrel thrashed violently, eyes rolling back into his head, foam flecking his lips. He didn't see the cabin. He didn't see Maris. He only saw the wolves, the death waiting just outside the walls. Caleb lunged forward instinctively, but Maris threw out an arm, stopping him. No! Her voice cracked with more than urgency. It cracked with understanding. This wasn't a wound she could fix with bandages. This was a wound of the soul, and it could only be healed one way. Without hesitation, Maris stepped into the stall. Sorrel roared, slamming his hooves down mere inches from her skull. Splinters of wood exploded from the walls. One wrong move, one breath too sudden, and he could have crushed her chest, snapped her spine like dry kindling. But Maris didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, she dropped to her knees in the straw. She opened her arms wide, exposing her chest, her throat, every vulnerable part of her body. She offered no defense, no threat, only herself. The Mustang's breath heaved in frantic bursts. Blood dripped from his side, staining her jacket red. He stomped once, twice, the heavy thud shaking the floor. Each stomp could have ended her. She stayed still. Then, very softly, Maris whispered. Not words of command. Not even words of comfort. Just her voice. Steady, broken, real. I'm here. It's okay. You're not alone. She repeated it over and over. A fragile lifeline thrown into the hurricane of his panic. At first, Sorrel didn't hear. Couldn't hear. His mind was drowning, sinking into a bottomless sea of fear and blood and memories. But something, a thread so thin it was almost invisible, caught onto those whispered words. The way a drowning man's fingers might brush a rope without realizing. Sorrel paused. For a fraction of a heartbeat, he froze. Steam poured from his nostrils, his body trembling so violently it seemed he would shatter. And then he looked down into Maris's eyes. She wasn't commanding him. She wasn't ordering him. Her eyes were filled with tears. Not fear for herself. Fear for him. Raw. Undeniable. Tears not of pity, but of refusal. Refusal to abandon him. Refusal to let the past steal him away. Sorrel's chest heaved once, violently. A shudder tore through his battered frame. And for the first time since the blizzard, since the betrayal, since the blood and the wolves and the cold, he chose. He chose to stop. Not because he was forced. Not because pain made him collapse. But because he saw, in that trembling human soul, something worth standing still for. With a low, broken whimper, Sorrel sagged. His knees buckled. His body folded down into the straw, collapsing into Maris's waiting arms. She cradled his blood-slicked head against her chest, pressing her forehead to his forehead, rocking him slightly like a child. The cabin filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing, their heartbeats. Two broken beings, finding in each other a flicker of light neither had dared believe in. Hours later, Caleb found them still there. Maris curled protectively around Sorrel's shivering body, her hands tangled in his mane. Neither one asleep, neither one fully awake. Just breathing, just being alive, together. The storm returned like a beast that had never truly left. Outside the cabin, the night shrieked and wailed, as if the very soul of winter had clawed its way back to the surface. Snow slammed against the timber walls in relentless waves. The chimney howled like a wounded animal. The shutters rattled so violently it seemed they might tear free from their hinges. Inside, Maris and Caleb worked desperately to reinforce the barricades, nailing planks across the windows, piling sacks of grain against the doors. Sorrel stood trembling in his stall, head low, muscles taut. His wounds had closed, but the scars beneath the skin were still raw, still bleeding in ways no eyes could see. Then, a new sound split the storm's chorus. Low, drawn out, savage. A howl, and then another, and another. The wolves had returned. Maris froze. Caleb swore under his breath, grabbing the rifle and checking the chamber. But Maris already knew, before she even looked into his grim, pale face, that it wouldn't be enough. Not tonight. The blizzard was too wild, the visibility too poor, and the wolves, driven mad by hunger, were no longer cautious. They were desperate. Paw prints circled the cabin. Shadows moved like smoke between the trees. Yellow eyes flashed in the darkness. Dozens of them, closing in with ruthless, inevitable patience. The wooden walls shuddered under the weight of bodies slamming against them. Scratching. Testing. Looking for weakness. The scent of blood, old and new, hung thick in the storm-racked air. It was only a matter of time. Maris stared at the rifle in Caleb's hands, at the way his fingers trembled, the way his lips pressed together in a thin, hopeless line. She saw the truth. If they waited, they would be overrun. Shooting a few would not stop the rest. The pack would tear through the walls. They would tear through her. Through Caleb. Through Sorrel. A single, clear thought rose above the roar of fear. This time, courage would not wear armor. It would wear skin. It would bleed. It would walk out into the storm naked and unarmed. Without a word, Maris dropped the hatchet from her belt. She stripped off her heavy coat, letting it fall onto the floor in a sodden heap. She unbuckled the knife from her hip. Caleb caught her arm roughly, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're out of your mind." She met his eyes, and he fell silent, because what he saw there wasn't madness. It was acceptance. It was the clarity of someone who had made peace with death. Maris stepped to the door. Sorrel whinnied behind her, a sharp, panicked sound that twisted her heart in two. She laid her hand against the wood, feeling the vibrations of snarling bodies just inches away. She drew a deep, steadying breath and pushed the door open. The storm hit her like a wall of knives. Snow whipped her face raw. The cold dug into her bones like claws. But she didn't falter. Barehanded, bareheaded, she stepped into the eye of the maelstrom. The wolves froze for a heartbeat, a ring of shadowed bodies, yellow eyes gleaming like cursed jewels, muscles bunched to pounce. The lead wolf, the massive gray brute she had seen that night in the forest, snarled low in his throat, lips peeling back over blood-stained fangs. Maris lifted her arms high, palms open, chest exposed. No weapon, no threat, only defiance made flesh. She locked eyes with the alpha. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her gaze said everything her voice could not. "Take me if you must, but you will not take what I protect." For a terrible, suspended moment, the world held its breath. Snow howled around her, tugging at her clothes, her hair, whipping her tears into ice on her cheeks. The lead wolf crouched low, muscles tensed, a growl coiled in his throat. And then he lunged. Time fractured. Maris saw it all in crystalline clarity. The wolf's jaws yawning wide, the lethal flash of teeth, the sheer, unstoppable mass of predator hurtling toward her. No way to dodge. No time to scream. Only enough time to understand. This was the end. And then a roar tore through the storm. Not human. Not wolf. Something deeper. Older. Wilder. Sorrel. He exploded from the cabin, splinters flying as he smashed through the crude stall door. He galloped through the blizzard like a living storm himself. A bloodied, battered warrior reborn. Straight into the wolf's path. With a sound that was part scream, part battle cry. Sorrel threw himself bodily between Maris and death. The alpha wolf's jaws closed. On Sorrel's shoulder. The impact was brutal. Sorrel staggered back. The wolf's teeth buried deep into his flesh. Blood gushed instantly, steaming in the frozen air. Maris screamed. A raw, ragged sound ripped from the deepest part of her soul. She lunged forward. Hands outstretched. Useless, powerless. As Sorrel reeled under the attack. Somehow, Sorrel didn't fall. Despite the teeth tearing into him. Despite the agony radiating from his shoulder. He held his ground. He drove forward with a savage, desperate lunge of his own. His teeth snapping at the wolf's throat. Startled by the resistance, the wolf released him, landing heavily on the snow-slicked ground. It snarled once, then backed away. Ears flat, tail low. Thrown off balance by the unexpected ferocity of the wounded horse. The other wolves wavered. Hesitated. And that was enough. Caleb fired from the cabin. One shot, two. Warning blasts into the air. The wolves, sensing the shift, sensing the loss of surprise, began to melt away into the trees. One by one. Until only the storm remained. Maris dropped to her knees beside Sorrel. The snow soaked her pants. Froze her skin. She didn't care. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against Sorrel's side, desperately trying to stem the bleeding. His body shuddered violently. His legs trembled. His great head sagged low toward her. No, no, no. Stay with me. Please. Tears blurred her vision. She cradled his bloodied face in her hands, pressing her forehead against his forehead, rocking him the way she had the night he first collapsed into her arms. Sorrel's breath rasped against her cheek. Slower. Fainter. Don't you dare leave me, she whispered, her voice cracking apart. Not now. Not after everything. The storm howled overhead. The world faded to white around them. And in that frozen, broken moment, Maris realized, for the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting for survival. She was fighting for him. The world held its breath. The storm weakened. The howls faded into the distance, carried off by the dying winds. The wolves, once so certain, so hungry, so cruel in their certainty of victory, now hesitated. Before them stood Sorrel, bleeding, broken, breathless, but still standing. The alpha wolf lowered his head, a low whine escaping his throat. The sight of the Mustang, the creature they had once marked for death, still standing despite the wounds, despite the blood streaming from his torn shoulder, despite the odds stacked against him, shattered the thin veneer of the pack's dominance. They understood. Not in words, not in thoughts, but in the primal, ancient language all predators spoke. This one will not fall. One by one, the wolves backed away. Ears flattened. Tails lowered. Defiance was a kind of weapon too. And tonight, Sorrel wielded it with the fury of a soul that had been to the edge and clawed its way back. Maris knelt beside him, one hand pressed against his trembling chest, the other gripping fistfuls of snow and blood-soaked earth. Tears streaming silently down her face. Not from fear. Not even from relief. But from awe. when the last of the shadows melted into the forest, when the only sounds left were the ragged breaths of survivors. Only then did Maris rise shakily to her feet. She turned her face toward the horizon, and for the first time in days, through the shredded remnants of the storm clouds, the sky began to burn. Sunrise. At first it was just a sliver of gold, thin and fragile against the iron-gray dawn. Then it thickened, spilling molten fire across the battered landscape. The snow blazed under the rising sun, each crystal igniting into 1,000 sparks. The cabin stood hunched and broken behind them, its roof sagging, its walls splintered, a tomb for the past they had survived. It no longer held them. Maris placed a trembling hand against Sorrel's battered shoulder. He flinched, then stilled. Slowly, with painful, deliberate steps, they moved forward, away from the cabin, away from the wreckage, toward the vast, open prairie, bathed in newborn light. Each step was agony for Sorrel, each breath a battle. But he walked. He did not falter. Maris stayed beside him, one hand light against his flank, neither leading nor forcing, only existing together in that sacred, fragile space. And then, as they reached the crest of a low rise, where the earth unfurled before them like a living tapestry of gold and fire, Sorrel stopped. The wind swept over them, carrying the scent of ice, of pine, of freedom. For a heartbeat, everything was still. The past, the pain, the fear, all of it dissolved beneath the sunrise. Maris turned to him, ready to offer comfort, ready to speak. But Sorrel spoke first, not in words, in something older, purer. He lowered his massive head, and with infinite slowness, in a gesture more sacred than any oath, he pressed his bloodied, battered muzzle against Maris's open hand. A simple act. No grand rearing. No wild galloping into the sunrise. Just a touch. A promise. A silent vow that needed no translation. I choose you. I trust you. I live because of you. Maris closed her fingers around his muzzle, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, her whole body trembling with a gratitude too large for her chest to hold. They stood there, a woman and a wild Mustang, battered, scarred, but unbroken. A new dawn kindled around them, not just in the sky, but inside their very bones. The past was ashes. The future was unwritten. And together, they would carve their place into it. As the sun climbed higher, Maris whispered into the winds, words carried on breath and blood and bone. It wasn't the will to fight that saved us. It wasn't strength. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even hope. It was trust. The choice to believe when there was nothing left to believe in. And now, to those who hear their story carried on the winds, to those who walk their own broken paths, to those who fight their own invisible battles, a question remains. When everything you love is falling apart, when the world turns its back on you, when fear and pain tear at your soul, will you stand your ground? Or will you turn away? They didn't survive because of strength. Not because of hooves. Not because of gunfire. They survived because they chose to trust each other when there was nothing left to believe in. Against the storms. Against the wounds. Against the fear that tried to crush their souls. They stood up. They clung to each other in the heart of. And you? When everything you love falls apart. When the whole world turns against you, will you stand your ground or will you turn away? Leave your answer in the comments. Subscribe now and never miss the stories that reach the deepest parts of the heart as we ride together with Gallop of Glory on a journey you will never forget.